Hello, everybody, and thank you for making time to attend the second event in the Sexuality and Nationalism in South Asia series. Thank you especially for making time on a holiday. This series is supported by the York Center for Asian Research and the Center for Feminist Research at York University. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Shraddha Chatterjee, a doctoral candidate in gender, feminist, and women's studies, and a Vanier scholar at York University. My research looks at the entanglements between Hindu nationalism and queer life in India. And I, for one, am very eager to learn from our two wonderful speakers who've joined us today. Naveen Minai is a limited term assistant professor at the Mark S. Bonham Center for Sexuality, Sexual Diversity Studies at the University of Toronto. Their work centers interdisciplinary analyses of Asian sexuality and masculinity in transnational popular cultures. They presented their work on brownness as analytic at the Modern Languages Association Conference in 2021, and their work on digital butch of color fashion and South Asian female masculinity is forthcoming in Feminist Theory in 2022 and the Journal of Autoethnography in 2022 also. I'm excited to wait for these papers to drop, Naveen. I don't know what to tell you. Nayma is an associate professor in global and international studies at Manhattanville College, and they are the author of Village Ties, Women, NGOs, and Informal Institutions in Rural Bangladesh, which came out with Rutgers University Press in 2021. And I can speak from experience as a fabulous book. So thank you for being here. And Naveen, I'll just hand over to you and let you do all of the introductions and whatever you want to say about your paper.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being with us across time zones today. Thank you to Shraddha for the invitation to participate in this series, and to Alicia and Alex for organizing the logistics. Nayma, I'm really excited to be in conversation with you. So my presentation today is titled Patriarchal Remains, Aurat March, Meaning and Mourning. And it is a version of a project I'm working on with one of my closest friends and co-thinkers, Dr. Sara Shroff. In our work, we take up a feminist act of protest, Pidar-shahi ka janaza, the funeral of patriarchy, at the first Aurat March organized in Karachi. The march was held at Fair Hall, a British Raj-era building, on March 8, 2018, International Women's Day, and the funeral procession traveled the route of the Aurat March. A white gauzy cotton cloth with white polka dots with an embroidered hem was laid out on top of a colorful charpai in the shape of a body, read as a woman's body. The symbolic body was lifted by organizers and participants, marking them as the bearers of the body among the crowd. Both the bearers and the other participants at the march were dressed not in the expected muted colors of a South Asian Muslim funeral, but in different shades and colors, including blues, reds, greens, yellows, blacks, purples, and pinks. At the foot of the charpai was a white piece of paper with the word Pidar-shahi written in bold black Urdu letters. The body shaped by the shroud signifies the violences of patriarchy, which was named as the cause of death at this janaza. Pidar-shahi ka janaza was a symbolic funeral procession performed according to the rituals of death and mourning in Muslim cultures. Thus, janaza as a frame of reference was recognizable in the vocabularies and frames of Muslim and Islamic cultures on a transnational scale and scope. The term Pidar-shahi was also instantly recognizable because it is a term in Urdu. This term is a composite of Pidar, meaning father, and Shahi, meaning rule. Pidar-shahi as patriarchal rule. Pidar-shahi names heteropatriarchy as a central structure of violence in modern South Asia. We ask, what does it mean to perform a rite and ritual of death and mourning at a feminist protest and march? How does this act reorient our analyses of the nature of patriarchal violence in Pakistan? And what does it mean to situate Pidar-shahi ka janaza as a transnational frame of feminist organizing and analysis? Pidar-shahi ka janaza is heavy with how globalized processes shape the meanings of ethnicity, class, caste, gender, sexuality, religion, citizenship, language, border, and state in Pakistan. The Aurat March Karachi of 2018 is situated within complex histories of forms, feelings, tactics, strategies, and goals of feminist organizing in the subcontinent. These histories include before, during, and after the partition of 1947 and the War of Liberation in 1971, before, during, and after the military dictatorships of Ayub Khan and Zia ul-Haq, before, during, and after the Cold War and the ongoing war on terror. We reorient our analyses away from linear, straight narrations of these histories as failures to narrations of these histories as living, transnational, uneven, continuous, and open. Janaza provides an order to and for grief, including a beginning and an end. The end of the janaza is the burial of the body and the congregational prayer, which focuses on forgiveness for the deceased. Mourners often return to the home of the family to pay their respect and to provide care. Yet the Pidar-shahi ka janaza did not culminate in a burial, and there was no home for mourners to return to pay their respects. If burial signifies closure, then there was no closure at this patriarchy ka janaza. We read this as an act of refusal to bury the cause of death, which does two things. First, if this janaza was of Pidar-shahi, the refusal to bury signals how Pidar-shahi is a structure still very much in effect in everyday life. Second, if the body symbolized those who have not survived heteropatriarchy, then the refusal to bury is about raising our dead precisely to name the cause of their deaths and to insist upon being haunted as a feminist responsibility. Rather than using ritual to lay our dead to rest, a Muslim ritual was used to refuse to bury their lives and memories as an act of feminist mourning. We are reminded that death in different forms is never far from the lives of women or from queer and trans lives, that violence is an ongoing and everyday experience, that there are many bodies and many ghosts. There was no family home to return to at the end of this janaza. We read this as a feminist and queer challenge to the notion of home. For those who die because of heteropatriarchy, the idea and space of home is contentious. Home does not always signal safety, love, care, comfort, security, peace, belonging, and the nourishment of life. Home can signify multiple violences, including economic and sexual insecurity, danger, and abuse. To be able to go home and to be at home are both conditional. Home as domestic space is a major site of patriarchal violence, a powerful institution where patriarchy is rooted, maintained, and perpetuated. The gendered division of space through the idea of home marked as private enables many of the violences of heteropatriarchy to go unnamed, unmarked, and unremembered. Therefore, the janaza also challenges the heteropatriarchal construction of home and the gendered division of public and private space. In challenging the patriarchal violence of home, the mourners also challenge the biologics of kinship that this ideology is based on. The word Pidar-shahi was written in Black Urdu script on a white placard at the feet of the symbolic corpse at the janaza. In Muslim custom, the dead are not usually named through written or now digital record at a janaza. When someone dies, their name is known through obituaries and or through social relations within which that person was embedded. Therefore, we read the naming of Pidar-shahi as a double move. Patriarchal violence is named on the body in writing, that is, as written record. Yet the body is not named as that of a person. The name recorded and made known is the cause of death. In not being marked with the name of a person, this body becomes a body that could have any name and any gender. The body as metaphor names any body through the structure that has caused their death. Moreover, patriarchy named in writing references the institutional violence that prohibits and erases records of gendered and sexualized violence. To record in writing this cause of death signals a challenge to this prohibition and this erasure as an act of feminist record keeping, evidence, and memory. The janaza challenges absences in official and popular archives of patriarchal violence. The symbolic body was carried and accompanied by those whose relation to each other and to the body is not defined through biologics of kinship. Instead, those who carried and attended the janaza were in relation to one another through the act of protesting heteropatriarchy. This relation was based on mourning those who have died and those who are trying to survive patriarchal violence. The feeling, therefore, of intimacy is based in an act of protest and the process of mourning. Pidar-shahi ka janaza enabled an alignment according to the coordinates of mourning and remembering violence and death among us that does not reproduce and reinforce biologics of kinship and intimacy. Pidar-shahi ka janaza names the cause of death through the metaphor of the body made material through the white shroud. We read the symbolic body at this janaza as a body that names the conditions that have caused violence and death. To read this body as a woman's body would be easy. However, we want to pause and ask what reading a body as a woman's body means. The body at the janaza was wrapped in a white shroud, the outline of which symbolized a woman's body, and the white cloth was a dupatta with a lace hem. To read woman onto body through cis heteronormative frames is to reproduce those necropolitics. Instead, we are instructed to attend to the causes of death, that is, the structures that produce, police, discipline, and condemn the legibility of bodies. Butch women and trans women, for example, are subjected to necropolitical violence precisely because they are not legible within cis heteronormative frames of life and subjectivity. Therefore, we read the body at the janaza as a metaphor to ask after all those bodies who are policed, punished, and condemned through these structures. Pidar-shahi ka janaza names the cause of death through the metaphor of the body, made material through the white shroud. In contravention of custom, the mourners who carried the janaza were not only cisgendered men, rather it was mourners who may have used different pronouns and terms for their gendered selves, some shared and some not. We want to attend to the messiness of janaza as a site and process in which gender, mourning, and grief are made legible and meaningful in complicated ways. One reading of why it might be customary for young able-bodied men to carry the janaza could be the gendered division of public space. Another reading could be the particular set of responsibilities and labor expected of young men as a sign of respect for their elders and communities. Yet another could be the gendered restrictions on grief in public that therefore require men carrying the janaza to express grief in this act rather than other visible ways. We argue that all of these meanings were reworked at the Aurat March in the multiplicity of identifications of the mourners. This labor and responsibility were shared rather than divided, according to heteropatriarchal gender roles. Public space, therefore, was also shared, which made space for different expressions of grief. This feminist use of Muslim ritual challenges at once the deployment of Islam as biopolitical and necropolitical tool by states such as Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and the phobic and philic Orientalist discourses about Islam and feminism. This feminist use of Muslim ritual challenges at once brand Islam as a form of global capital, and the branding of fantastic, red fantasy versions of Islam as productive for colonial and post-colonial forms of war and empire. This feminist use of Muslim ritual refuses the turns for practice and conversation from either or, and reorients our frames away from the compulsion to explain Islam, Pakistan, and feminism to the terms and conditions set by the desires and attachments of the global North. This transnational feminist act does not offer easy or transparent explanations of Islam, feminism, or Pakistan. Rather, Pidar-shahi ka janaza offers different questions. The question is not, is feminism secular or Islamic in Pakistan? The question is, what are the forces that shape systems of violence in Pakistan? Pidar-shahi ka janaza focuses on patriarchal violence as the cause of death, creating space for alignments among differently situated communities around the system and structure of violence. This alignment does not erase and dismiss the differences between forms and degrees of violence and the resources available to different peoples and communities to cope with and survive patriarchal violence, precisely because the focus was on Pidar-shahi as a system, rather than a particular archetype of perpetrator, victim, and survivor. Pidar-shahi in Pakistan is a system of violence dense with and accumulative of the multiple and ongoing violences of globalized forms of war, empire, and capital. Heteropatriarchal violence in Pakistan is co-constitutive of militarization and securitization, the politics of urbanization as a sign of modernity in the global South, the geopolitics of Sunni supremacy, global flows of feeling, capital, labor, and aesthetics. This includes the material, affective, and cultural legacies of the partition of 1947, the War of Liberation 1971, the Cold War, the War on Terror, and multiple military dictatorships. These structures and effects are not separable. Rather, they congeal into the rhythms and intimacies of everyday life. Zara Malkani and Shahana Rajani discuss how logics of securitization and militarization are produced by and anchored in, quote, multi-scalar expansion of the Pakistani state military apparatus into all spheres of life, as well as an influx of global capital with similar wartime agendas into the cultural and academic spheres, end quote. These logics and their effects seep into the ordinary intimate rhythms of life and death, incorporating and anchoring patriarchal violence. For example, Securitization underpins the harassment and displacement of poor working class and sex worker communities from Defense Housing Authority as land owned by the military and marked with social and economic privilege and aspiration, including the promise of safety, even as global capital in the form of real estate development companies in business with national, provincial, and city authorities require the destruction of poor and working class housing in neighborhoods in the name of law and development. The affective and cultural effects of militarization on questions of sexuality and sex as matters of national security, sexuality and sexual morality as a matter of national security include paranoia and pride as twinned feelings weaponized as tools of patriarchal violence. Patriarchal violence in the key of militarization functions at a different frequency, and we situate this frequency in the reverberations of what Malkani and Rajani call the everywhere war. Paranoia and pride as tools of patriarchal violence generate discourses of feminisms as foreign espionage and sabotage, accusations that allegations of patriarchal violence are defamation and betrayal on a national scale, and the dismissal of survivors and victims of patriarchal violence as conspirators with American empire through discourses of Islamophobia. Paranoia and pride are used to set standards and measures of victim and survivor that cannot be met as a deliberate strategy to deny and dismiss patriarchal violence. In the context of Pidar-shahi in Pakistan, this strategy incorporates the notion of foreign sabotage into these standards and measures. For example, modes of sexual desire, gender embodiment, digital presence, sexual autonomy, and public presence are marked as foreign, as conspiracy, as sabotage to national pride. Justifications for and dismissals of patriarchal violence. The janaza is neither a beginning nor an end as discrete temporal events. Rather, it is a ritual space and act of mourning as feminist protest. Janaza is the matter of death and is the procession of making the dead matter. At the janaza of Pidar-shahi, the body as metaphor allowed protesters to name the patriarchal violence as a system. As a ritual, janaza offers certain rules for grieving, including a frame of time out of consideration for life. In other words, we must end the process of grieving in order to continue living. Yet the Pidar-shahi ka janaza demands a different process and frame. How do we stop mourning when we are embedded within systems that cause death? How can the refusal to bury signal a refusal to forget these causes of death? To remain haunted, to remember without closure, to refuse to bury. What might these practices of mourning enable us to recognize and to do? If the namaz janaza is a prayer for forgiveness, what does it mean for feminist forms of mourning that refuse to forgive? We refuse to recite the namaz janaza for Pidar-shahi. We remain in mourning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naveen. I think that talk was wonderfully complex, and we will remain with that talk for a long time. But we will now move on to Nayma. And Nayma, I'll kind of just hand over to you. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Naveen, I'm so excited to be in conversation with you. And, now that I've sort of, heard what you have to say, and I'm sitting here thinking that our work is so much, has so much more in common than I thought it did. Especially around questions of structural violence, around questions of patriarchy, and the normative elements of it, of these questions. So my work is on Bangladesh, and and the inherent contradiction in the question that Bangladesh is known as this development miracle, achieving all of these incredible goals when it comes to globally recognized development outcomes. But at the same time, when it comes to women's lives, much like you see across a lot of the global South, Bangladesh is very far behind. Rural Bangladeshi women suffer from some of the highest rates of violence in the global South in terms of domestic violence, child marriage, dowry, and dowry-related violence. So for this talk, I will draw on some of the research and findings around my book, Village Ties, and I will talk about how poor women from a rural civil society organization challenged some of the exclusionary informal institutions or social norms, which are very much tied to social constructions of gender. The organization that I study, its called Poli Shamaj, and it is a women's civil society group that's implemented by the development agency BRAC. And what's interesting about Poli Shamaj is that it is a women's mobilization group run by very sort of within the framework of very neoliberal planning and strategies. But because it is not particularly well funded, it's almost sort of neglected that area. Not a lot of people care about it, which means the women are essentially free to do what they want. So about 12,000 groups exist across Bangladesh, and they operate on a ward level. A ward is a collection of villages. So, and the groups can be from, they can have from 40 to about 120 members. So I wanted, my talk is titled around, it's organized around this concept of a good girl and what it means to be a good girl and what it means to sort of uphold these expectations, right, around women's gender roles. So Bangladesh has a very complicated history when it comes to the intersection of religion and politics. Post-partition, when Bangladesh was a part of United Pakistan, the two nations were brought together on, based on this common Islamic identity. But in 1971, after the Liberation War, when Bangladesh became an independent state, even as the constitution granted women equal rights in the public sphere, in the family and family matters, religious laws still governed women's lives. So after independence, the Bangladesh government embraced an aid-based, donor-driven development strategy, which was sort of, came on the heels of the war and famine, and it was like, never again, right? We're never going to go through this again. But what that meant was there was an influx of aid from both Western donors, but also Islamic sources. And especially in the 90s, there was a massive influx of aid from both religious and faith-based NGOs, many of whom delivered services alongside the Western NGOs. So you had Islamic institutions that financed schools and hospitals and other service institutions. And that also empowered local religious leaders. So you had this tension between the Western NGOs telling women come out of the house and mobilize, but then you had a sort of more Islamic presence, which advocated for a different kind of development where women were not, mobilized. So as one pushed women out of the house, the other pushed them back in. So it is within this context that Poli Shamaj was created in the 1990s. And the very goal of the group was to challenge oppressive practices. The group works in three areas. They negotiated with local service providers to redistribute local resources. They increase women's participation in local governance. And the area that I'm going to talk about is they increase poor people's access to the law. And what that means is that they intervene when they hear about cases around dowry, child marriage. They record and respond to cases of violence, domestic violence, intimate partner violence in the community. And they advocate for the poor, and especially poor women in informal local judicial and decision-making spaces like local village courts. So when it comes to legal issues, the women of Poli Shamaj challenge these social norms around women's gendered roles. In these contexts, development programs often assume that you give women services and training and these top-down things, and they will take this and liberate themselves. And there's this really problematic discourse, right? But the truth is that the women are not free to act as they choose, and their actions are shaped by these rules on the ground that are tied to shared expectations around what it means to fulfill their social gendered roles, right? And to be a good girl. So since I'm focusing on dowry and child marriage are gendered institutions. They subscribe to these stereotypes about men and women's attributes and experiences. And they subscribe to the bounds of women's appropriate roles and behaviors, how a woman should be and what she should do. So in rural Bangladesh, a woman's position is tied to the socially desirable goal of marriage and playing the ideal daughter, wife, and mother. So the rules that dictate her behaviors, as well as those of her family, are meant to exalt her reputation, her marriageability, her chastity, and once married, staying married, right, regardless of what happens inside her marriage. So before marriage, she's an obedient daughter, but after marriage, her primary responsibility is that of what we say in Bengali, Sangsar Kara, which is the act of living a domestic life. And that term encompasses all of her marital duties, starting from her sexual and reproductive obligations to cooking and cleaning and managing the household, to also, bringing in some money and engaging in some labor activity outside of the house. So essentially, while her husband would be the provider, her role would be to play the role, run the household and play the role of the nurturer. So essentially, when it comes to dowry and child marriage, notions of masculinity and femininity determine the actions of not just potential brides, but also their families, right? The woman needs to be married, and the parents' job is to get her married at any cost, whether that means marrying her young because they think this is the best thing she can do, or if it means paying a dowry, which puts them into cycles and cycles of loans. The idea is that, when they have a good marital prospect, what they call a halochile, a good boy, you have to kind of hold on to that and make sure that prospect doesn't go away, and you have to be a good girl to find a good boy. So I want to go into one of the stories that really kind of I found to be really powerful in most of and oh my god, I can't find words today. I'm just gonna read the story. In Maguez, Shripur Upazila, one woman said in an interview that a potential groom's family had come to see her sister-in-law, Kajol. And, in this context, see means kind of coming to scope her out and see if she's pretty, see if, which one of these skills she embodies. So they said that the family said they liked Kajol and they claimed to have no demand. And here the word demand means dowry. It literally translates into, that's a word that's used on the ground. So, but they said that the family must adorn the bride, which means they must deck her in gold. So at this point, the sister-in-law protests and says that, maybe Kajol should finish school. But the brother, Kajol's elder brother, he put his foot down and he said that the young man had a good job. We cannot find a good boy like this so easily. So eventually the wedding took place. And for Kajol, there was a trade-off between marriage and education because she had most likely left school. So here, the potential groom was a good boy because he had a job. But there is a kind of hierarchy there, right? A working man was good. A man with a secure job was better. But a wealthy family with landed property was the ideal goal. And so, and when you had such instances in the villages, the women of Polishamaj intervened. And when they discovered some impending dowry or child marriage situation sort of bubbling up in the community, they came together to plan an intervention. And they tried to change the shared expectations around these practices. So when the women intervened, they were often told, oh, this is just how things are done here. And we're going to go ahead and do it because it doesn't matter what the law is. These are our practices. But the other side of the story was that when they intervened, the families also told them that if we don't do this, we are going to be chastised by society. So essentially, the families themselves face sanctions when they refuse to pay dowry or sort of wait until their daughters are older, because the cost of avoiding this is particularly high for young women. Society would deem them unmarriageable. The families would be chided and ostracized and become the subject of gossip and ridicule when you have an unmarried daughter in the house. So, essentially, when the Polish Samaj groups negotiated with families to stop weddings involving dowry or child marriage, they shifted practices in two ways. First, they challenged this logic of what is appropriate behavior for both the parents and for the daughter. So when the women visited homes during wedding preparations and sometimes during the wedding itself, they conveyed the illegality and dangers of both practices to the parents. And they warned the parents that early marriage could jeopardize their daughter's physical and emotional health. And often they did this in public, in front of other people. So there was an element of accountability involved. And eventually, through this very public conversation, they managed to change the discourse and shift the discourse. So there was kind of a public and collective understanding that education for the girl or waiting or her health, her wellness was what the parents should consider. And that is the appropriate behavior. And that is what is the shared expectation now, as opposed to her being married. So for the women themselves, doing this work meant that they themselves were challenging notions of appropriate and gendered behaviors, and they were shaking up these sort of religious notions of what it meant to be a good woman. Essentially, so for example, when the women gathered to go to village court, when there were these socially, so when there were these cases in village court around, for example, divorce or domestic violence, they were seen as, the women themselves were seen as behaving inappropriately, right? Because they were moving into spaces that were male-dominated spaces, elite-dominated spaces. So when they attended, try to speak up to defend women, they were seen as women of ill repute. And they were challenging these, the notions of these gendered roles in those spaces as well. So I wanted to read one story that sort of takes you through what happened when the women were doing this work. In Taraganj, the local Polish Samaj group secretary was slapped with a dowry request during her daughter's wedding festivities. The groom's family had asked for taka 50,000. The mother insisted that she could not afford the sum, but the groom's family threatened that they would eventually break off the alliance if she could not pay. They made their demand at the wedding venue after the guests had arrived. No young woman's parents would want a biyabhanga, a canceled wedding, on the wedding day. It would damage their honor and tarnish the bride's reputation. The Polish Samaj leaders said in their interview, when we discovered what was going on, we started thinking about the weak points of the groom's family. While deliberating on a solution, Polish Samaj members came to know that the groom was smitten with the bride. The couple were actually in love, and this was a love marriage. They attended the wedding as if nothing was amiss. Once at the venue, they pulled the groom aside. Polish Samaj leaders said they asked him if he was planning to marry the money or the girl. They recalled the boy got embarrassed and married the girl without dowry. His family was upset and threatened to leave the wedding. But Polish Samaj members walked over to the groom's house and stated that dowry is haram and Islamic. They said, the couple was given plenty of gifts instead. The women added, the girl is pretty, why will you not agree? The women negotiated with the groom on a competing logic of appropriateness. They shamed him on two counts, that of being inconsiderate to the woman he loved and that of adopting un-Islamic norms. Thus, they compelled him to shift his behavior to new appropriate course of action. I wanted to end with this story because there are so many contradictions here around gendered norms of appropriate behaviors, and it demonstrates how complex society is and how complex the rules on the ground are, and in how religious and indigenous practices intersect and influence daily behaviors. On the one hand, they are opposing dowry, which the parents who are claiming to be good Muslims are engaging in, and they're saying this is un-Islamic. On the other hand, when they're telling them that, oh, the girl is pretty, they're also subscribing to gendered norms themselves. So, I was almost, when I wrote the story, when I started looking at the story in depth for my book, I almost didn't know where to end with this because there's so many intersecting threads here. And I think the understanding or the place where I ended up was that you always have in any given situation these competing logics of appropriateness that can go in multiple directions. But to conclude, I would like to come back to this idea of institutional change, that when it comes to legal issues and when it comes to women's lives at large, institutional change comes from challenging these shared expectations around appropriate behaviors. And when you sort of when you challenge these expectations and when you try to develop these new understandings around what is appropriate behavior, that's only when institutional change can happen. Now, one last thing I completely forgot to mention is when all of this fails, the women actually threaten legal action, and there were instances where they eventually said, "We're going to go to the police," and they go to the police station, and they kind of rile up, the police officers, and they come back to the wedding or the family's house, and they have these really public exchanges, which gets really ugly sometimes. But they do end up stopping the wedding a lot of the times, and they do end up intervening or making sure the wedding happens without dowry. So I would like to end here and hand back to Shraddha, and I'm really excited to see where this conversation goes.
Thank you so much, Nayma. I think that was absolutely fantastic. And again, became another way in which your book kind of came alive for me. I do have many questions. I think I want to focus on particularly one question, which is, which for me, I think juxtaposes both your presentations and your work in a very interesting kind of way. And I want to kind of ask, how does the death of patriarchy speak to Nayma's work? So, for example, what would it mean to do a kind of Pidar-shahi ka janaza in the context of the Polish Samaj, or in the Bangladeshi context? And at the same time, what would it mean to then think about living with or negotiating with patriarchy, especially through the question of haunting now in Naveen's work, right? So I think that's where I want to leave you, and we'll see where it goes.
Thank you. Oh my God, there's so much to think about, because there is a part of my work that is on violence. That's not, there are intermarriage violence too, but I mean that is on domestic violence, and specifically on the physical harm inflicted on women's bodies. But I think the logics are the same. And Naveen, when I was hearing you speak, I was thinking it is the public nature of these deliberations and expressions, right? That is so kind of startling here, because when it comes to Polish Samaj, their meetings are public. They meet in public. They engage people in public. Very little happens behind closed doors. So now you're encouraging me to think about this, not just in terms of public negotiations and shifting discourse, but also the expressive and the performative nature of their work.
Yeah, and obviously because this what I presented is part of a larger paper, but Nayma, I love what you said, and Shraddha, I appreciate the question so much, because one of the things that I think one of the points that I would begin with is to think about the conditions that shape the different iterations of what we might read as feminist, whether declared or otherwise, organizing, and the forms that it takes in and across Pakistan and Bangladesh, right? Because I also just want to be careful about respecting the specificities of each state, just because it's very tempting to say South Asia, but we need to be very careful about its specificities. But just and the thing that the way that I heard what Nayma was talking about is that both of our presentations today are about different strategies and tactics that feminists have deployed and mobilized to deal with heteropatriarchal violences and their very intimate and ordinary and heavy and dense, sort of glued in systems, right? And so, Nayma, the organization that you're dealing with is one iteration, and it has a set of goals, but it deploys, right? Like, so I heard that there's a very particular and deliberate mobilization of the force of the state in the form of the police as an intervention. That is a strategy, right? Which is also, so for example, in Pakistan, feminist organizing also has that history, right, of legally and politically and culturally formally recognized organizations, including NGOs, that negotiate and mobilize forces of the state as strategy. But then there's also other iterations and forms and formations of feminist organizing, for example, the Aurat March, and a lot of people who are involved not only in the Aurat March, but also in other causes and gatherings in Pakistan and across Pakistan that do not engage in those mobilizations, right? And do not negotiate with the state. And so I think that the thing that I will say, right, is that we need to be very careful about making sure that analytically we understand the relationships and between strategy, tactic, goal, right, when it comes to feminist organizing and feminist praxis, right? Because I think it's a slippery slope to collapse them. And so that is what I hear the strongest between my work and Nayma's, which is that we're both exploring these multiple iterations and formations, but also strategies and tactics towards goals that actually are I would say shared, but that different feminist organizers engage with and negotiate and manage in different ways. Nayma, did that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have so many thoughts because, you know, I'm automatically thinking of the different iterations within the organization itself, because, you know, BRAC is the world's largest development organization, and, you know, it is, and that's a problem, right? Let's just be like honest. And the reason why Polish Samaj is the way it is because they're not income generating. Nobody cares about them, right? So the strategies that the women develop, it's very bottom up because they're not getting anything from the top. And whatever they get from the top is so abstract, and they recognize it as being, you know, this doesn't really work for us, right? So it's a very different kind of feminist organizing in that it is absolutely ground up. Now, where do they intersect with BRAC and other organizations? They do other work with those organizations. So it's not as if they're completely like not married at all. But I'm curious, and I don't know much about this in Pakistan, and also in terms of the Aurat March. What is the relationship, I'm wondering, of like other NGOs and other institutions, and how do they all come together in this process for you? Because I'm thinking, well, so much works with other BRAC programs, but it's separate. But in Bangladesh, also you have this really strong women's movement, but over time they're becoming what we call NGOized because they get all this, you know, donor money, and Sohail and Nazneen has done a lot of work on this. They get all this donor money. They have to meet some donor outcomes, but they're also resisting it because they're like, well, we're going to hold on to whatever we can. So there is a lot of negotiation there too, on that level.
So the Aurat March is not, I just want to clarify, the Aurat March is not, and actually there are some of my friends, including one of my favorite Pakistani feminist scholars, Faiza Mushtaq, is in fact here. And also a wonderful Pakistani scholar and friend who's actually at York University, Shima Khavar, is also here. So both of I feel like they'll let me know if I'm wrong about this, but the Aurat March is not an NGO, right? And so, right. The reason I wanted to just make that clear is that the phenomena, Nayma, that you discussed, NGOization, right, is also definitely a part of the geopolitical frame of praxis, organizing, capital, infrastructure in Pakistan. And one of the things analytically that I want to think about is, again, the analytic and theoretical vocabularies that we have available for us and that we're crafting ourselves, right, in relationship to be able to understand not only NGOization as a very particular process of global capital war empire, but also of strategy and tactic developed by feminist organizers and a lot of queer and trans organizers, right, in Pakistan. right? It's never just one thing, right? And what I'm very passionate about is crafting analytic and theoretical vocabularies that do not insist on the one thing, right? So, but also then to think about the tensions and the contradictions and the conflicts between different iterations of feminist, queer, and trans organizing, right? Whether it's in the form and formation of a march that happens every year, whether it is in the form of formal organizations like NGOs, whether it's in the form of, for example, faculty associations, right? Or student unions and or labor unions, right? And so, or anti-war coalitions, right? And so for me, it's very important to think about those points of both potential coalition, but also to make sure that we do hold space for where the goals and strategies and feelings and tactics are not so easily aligned, right? And then what, right? And then what do we do? Where do we go from there? And that's one of the reasons why in the larger project, Sara Shroff and I are both, I hope, very careful to think about the histories, not just current frames and formations, but histories of feminist and queer and trans organizing in and from Pakistan, like as continuous and living, right? Because like NGOization itself is not something that, for me, I think we can read outside of, for example, right, like transnational frames of capital, empire, and war, right? And I think that, for Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, India, it is very important for us to develop our analytic vocabularies for the iterations of those processes and their effects very, very carefully.
I think we've had some wonderful prompts here, and it's also been helped a lot by just the amazing capacity that Naveen and Nayma, both of you have to kind of keep the conversation going and kind of just think with each other, which is really beautiful. But at this time, I really want to thank the participants for making the time and coming. Thank you for agreeing. Thank you for being so generous. And it's absolutely been fantastic.